Okay, welcome again to our 8th International English Online Conference. To go on with our conference, we have the second plenary, which will be delivered by our good friend and incredible professional, Randall Davis. Let me say a few words about Randall. Randall Davis has worked in the TESOL arena for the past 35 years as a teacher, materials developer, and a teacher trainer, specializing in educational technology, language assessment, and soft skills development. He has been an invited speaker to many diverse places, including Saudi Arabia, China, Peru, Japan, Mexico, Thailand, and throughout the United States. He is also the creator of the very famous and renowned website Randall's ESL Cyber Listening Lab. And he currently teaches at the English Language Institute at the University of Utah. In his free time, Randall enjoys trail running in the mountains, gardening, and learning each other from his mistakes. I like that. Thank you very much. And a warm round of virtual applauses for you. Thank you, dear Randall. And the screen is all yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And right now I see everyone. I mean, ideally, something like this would be great if we were face to face. If you've ever attended, I always tell my colleagues, if you've ever attended a conference in Latin America and Peru and Mexico, wherever, it's a very warm, cordial, powerful environment to be in. So we'll do what we can in this situation. And so, again, I encourage you to use the chat feature to share any comments that you might have. So my presentation is called Think Better, Act Better, an Approach to Global Citizenship. And one of the things that I find, I think, is very critical in the world today is that we become very aware that in all arenas of thought, whether we're dealing with education, we're dealing with politics, whether we're dealing with, education, science, information has a vast power to engender a compassionate humanity, but it also has the power to wield a sword of injustice and often discrimination against, many times, many of the marginalized groups in our society. And one of the things that I want to focus on today in the presentation is to talk about the forces that often shape the way that we see the world, because how we think shapes the way that we behave in so many arenas of thought. And also, as teachers, we have the responsibility to empower our students to understand and to be able to sift through all kinds of information that they find online, to be able to examine that information. And the next part of the presentation, I want to explain ways in which teachers, you and I, can actually help students analyze information so that this type of instruction can lead to better and healthier attitudes toward our world neighbors. Now, one of the dangers, I'm just going to say right now, one of the dangers of inviting someone like me is that in the traditional training model, what we usually do is you invite a speaker from overseas who is really unfamiliar with the context in which he is speaking, and this trainer kind of drops from the sky and gives some type of motivational speech to the weary soldiers, teachers in the trenches. And then that trainer is airlifted out, leaving often the participants who are watching a broadcast like this just undersatisfied, disappointed, and feeling disconnected from the talk. In other words, sometimes when you invite people like me, only me, and I know that you have a variety of speakers, people want to walk away from a plenary like this with a feeling, he spoke my language. She connected with me. She understood the concerns that I have. So with that in mind, what I felt like doing is rather than just speaking myself, and again, I am encouraging any of you to use the chat feature to comment at any time, I brought on a special guest panel during the last few minutes of the plenary to speak on, number one, what examples of poor critical thinking do you see come up in your classrooms, in your everyday life? You might be thinking about that as well. In what ways are these points of critical thinking so relevant to your own teaching situation, your own social circumstances? And the last question I have is, what instructional ideas do you have, again, to the panelists and to all of those of you who are watching, what ideas, instructional tips do you have to actually encourage critical thinking for both high resource environments and low resource environments? In other words, whether you're working, you're teaching in a facility, in an organization that has all of this technology, or if you're teaching your students under a palm tree on the beach, we want to make sure that the ideas that we share about critical thinking and teaching those ideas in the classroom are relevant to everyone. So again, feel free to share. We'll bring on the panel a little bit later. I want to begin with something so important. This was a game-changing experiment in the field of cognitive psychology. And in 1999, Daniel Simons, who was a professor at Harvard University, and a graduate student named Chris Chabris, decided to conduct a study. And in this study, they had one group, 3 people in white shirts, and one group in black shirts. And they asked each team to pass the basketball to each other. And during that, those that were watching the study, they were asked to count how many times the people in white shirts passed the basketball to each other. Well, in the middle of that study, in the middle of that video, a woman dressed up in a gorilla suit passed into the screen, pounded on her chest, and walked off the screen, and was on the screen for a total of 9 seconds. But only 50% of the people saw the gorilla. And it was a study in what they called inattentional blindness. Sometimes we're so focused on a piece of information, we're focused on a particular thing that is going on around us, when we can't see something in front of our eyes. And what they were trying to allude to, and again, you can actually, there's a website called The Invisible Gorilla. There's a book called The Invisible Gorilla as well. And one of the things that came out of the study is this. Number one, you have to learn about the everyday illusions that work in your life. Otherwise, you could be victimized by them in the future. In other words, sometimes we think we understand the world better than we really do. We sometimes think our memory is better than our families. We sometimes think that we think more critically than everyone else. But that is an illusion. They also said you want to be wary of thinking you know more about things than you really do. So what is happening in so many cases is, if you become aware that you don't see things the way they really are, you can, in the end, make better decisions, live a better life, and you can look for the invisible gorillas in your life. Now, how is this related to actually the topic of be better and act better and becoming a better global citizen? Well, one of the things that we find in life is the world and our students are constantly being flooded with information. It's kind of like an unfiltered tidal wave of information from blogs, from YouTube, from TikTok, and so forth. And sometimes this amount of information shapes the way that we think, shapes the way that we behave. And with that in mind is that, I don't know, when was the last time any of you had a student go down to the, that old place called the library? When was the last time they spent time in the library? And telling a student to go to the library is like taking an interplanetary trip to the planet Neptune. It almost never happens. And so what often we find in life is people often take the path of least resistance. In other words, the path that requires less critical thinking. And it's always surprising to me is, why are we so willing to accept advice on existential issues from the guy sitting in the hot tub that gleams something from a TikTok video? I mean, we're so willing to accept anything. So one of the things I did in preparation for some of these ideas, I started to analyze. And again, feel free to use the chat if you have any comments, because I'd like to add any comments to the conversation. For the presentation, I decided to actually talk with teachers. It was a very limited poll. The idea of how capable do you think your students are in determining the reliability of information. I had 18 people in this small survey, and 2 of the teachers felt very skilled. 14 said somewhat skilled, and some said not skilled at all. And then I asked them, well, what do you do to train your students to think more critically? And they said something like use Google Scholar. I asked them to check the reliability of information. I always lead them to the source. But one of the things that is related to this, what does research show us of how careful students are able to really analyze information? And this was a fascinating study. And this was Weinberg and McGrew. And Weinberg and McGrew, what they were wanting to find out is that to what degree are young people? They surveyed 7,800 students across 12 states in the United States from both high schools and college. And they were trying to determine how, again, as I mentioned, how careful are they in analyzing information? And some of the things that they came up with was the results were quite surprising. Number one, you want to be careful that many of us assume that young people are fluent in media. In other words, they might be digitally savvy, but maybe they're not really careful on how they analyze information. They also found out in their study that young people often can't distinguish the difference between well-established groups and information and fringe sources. And overall, young people's ability to reason, well, it could be summed up in one word: bleak. Now, that might be watching this or saying, well, teachers are a lot better. Well, the reality is McGrew and Weinberg decided to do an additional study to actually find out if PhD professors were any better than students. So what they did is, in their particular study, they were looking at 45 individuals, 10 PhD professors, 10 professional fact checkers, and 25 college students. What did they find? Again, replicating a similar study, is what they found is that the historians weren't any better in analyzing information than their students. They fell victim to the same ruses. They often fell victim to the ideas of others out there. And they asked, what was the difference between the fact checkers, the PhD teachers, and the students? And it was the way in which they analyzed information. And you see on the top, it says lateral reading. It was basically how they read the web pages, how they scanned the web pages really made a difference. And this particular article is available online. And before I forget, at the beginning and at the end of this PowerPoint, I will have a link to where you can download this PowerPoint, so you don't have to copy everything that I'm saying or taking screenshots. So again, I'll provide a link to this PowerPoint at the end. So the question is, if teachers are not any better than students in analyzing information, why is that the case? Well, sometimes we see news, but when we start looking carefully at the news, and again, we'll talk about how to actually do this, is that this was an interesting fact that often 9 out of 10 North Americans don't fact check. And what they do is they have a tendency to spread fake news because they put too much trust in the information that they see and find. Well, why is all of this so important? And why this is so important is if you're looking at unreliable information, and we do fall victim to it, is that it can engender biases, faulty reasoning, stereotypes, unquestionable evidence, which is so important. And Brian, thank you for sharing the Dunning-Kruger effect. We'll perhaps make reference to that a little bit later. So again, bad information can lead to bad action and attitudes toward others. And these beliefs, again, can lead toward negative attitudes and actions toward others in the community. And we can think of this on a small scale and a much larger scale. So what I would like to share with you now is with the ideas of information and how that information can play out in our daily lives. I would like to share with you 7 different points that teachers can implement in their classrooms, but not just their classrooms, in their families, in their communities, where as a result of thinking better, we act better toward others around us in a global setting. So these are some of the things I'm going to talk about. And I think all of us would agree. We could analyze any of these points about why these thinking errors occur and what we can do. And I'm going to briefly go over those. And then I'm going to bring on the panel to discuss their experiences as well, because I think you'll find that part really interesting. Let's take a look at it. Again, the first 3 things I want to discuss is recognizing your role in empowering students, becoming aware of how unaware we are, and understanding the nature of logical fallacies and heuristics, which are mental shortcuts. And then we'll talk about some of the others in a minute. So first of all, I think we need to recognize our role as a 21st century educator. We are moving away, certainly, from the idea of providing information like what is the capital of Nepal or what does the flag look like of Syria, to where we're encouraging students to think critically about the information around them. And again, we can analyze a number of situations in our world today where critical thinking becomes important. With that in mind, I have to acknowledge that true wisdom is knowing that you know nothing. It's kind of like, now, Jaime, you said at the beginning that I've been teaching 35 years. And a lot of times people say, I've been teaching for so long. But that doesn't qualify you any better. I mean, true wisdom is knowing that you know little. And I would have to say in the last 5 years of my teaching, that has been the most transformative experience of my life. And by knowing and recognizing my role, what I often will do is I need to set aside my ego and personal agenda, because my goal is to make me unnecessary. In other words, the best teachers are those who show you where to look, but don't tell you what to see. In other words, encouraging critical thinking. But a good teacher is one who makes himself or herself progressively unnecessary. That is my job, not for students to continue to look to me, but looking beyond. And Tanya says, the more and talking about Einstein, the more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know. Thank you, Tanya, for sharing that. And another comment came up, the more we learn, the less we know. That's absolutely true. So thank you for sharing those ideas. So what I mean is, if I can tell students there's a lot that I don't know and be honest about it, I think that can lead to better critical thinking. The next idea is understanding the illusion of knowledge and confidence. And sometimes we don't realize how wrong we are. And one of my favorite books is called Being Wrong. And again, we're so unaware of how unaware we are. And so right now, I want to show you a picture. And again, it would be great if we could have a show of hands, but because of the nature of the presentation, I just want you to think about this. Tell me what you think and tell me what you see. Okay, now watch carefully. Okay, what did you see?
A tiger, a tiger.
Okay, Jaime says a tiger. Now, Jaime, you're the one that is speaking for the entire group. That's okay. Many times when people look at this, they see one tiger. But if you know where to look, again, there's the tiger. Brian says, Bonnie says there was riding on the tiger. Thank you, Bonnie.
The hidden tiger.
The hidden tiger. So in other words, in addition to being a 21st century teacher where you recognize that you don't know everything, recognizing that you might not see the hidden gorillas in front of you, that you might not see the way that the world really is, that we have a tendency to see the world through the prism of our own understanding. I think that is so critical to critical thinking. And a related point is this, is understanding, and Brian, yeah, she had a good eye. Thank you, Bonnie, for seeing that. Understand and dismantle faulty reasoning. Now, many times when we talk about critical thinking, the reality is we only understand it a centimeter deep. In other words, we only understand critical thinking at a very superficial level. And as I mentioned, we have to be aware of our own faulty reasoning. So critical thinking skills are essential, but you have to know what types of flawed arguments are there. If you don't understand flawed arguments, then you won't be able to see them in media and in conversations with others. So one of my favorite books is right here. It's called You Are Not So Smart. And this book highlights many, many different types of heuristics, which are mental shortcuts, illogical reasoning. And right from the beginning, it says this: the misconception. You feel, sometimes we feel we are rational beings. We see the way that the world really is, but other people don't. Well, that's a flawed argument, because the reality in the book, it says this, which I think is important. The truth is you are just as deluded as the rest of us. And that's okay, because being deluded is part of being human. In other words, we think we see the world the way it is. We think we understand news, but we really don't. So with that in mind, and there are a number of books, and again, Jaime, don't let me forget at the very end, I will put in that link. There'll be a link on the PowerPoint so that people can download this. But there are many books: Being Wrong, The Invisible Gorilla. All of these are books that really help us understand better the world around us. And let me give you a simple example of one of the most powerful examples of a thinking error that all of us do. And it's called confirmation bias. It means that we sometimes feel our conclusions are the result of careful examination. But the reality is not that case, as we tend to seek out information that proves our existing beliefs and ignore any evidence to the contrary. So imagine, for example, that Brian or Jaime or any one of you, you've gone to your doctor and your doctor says, you know what? You need to cut out eating 10 donuts a day. Okay. And your favorite donut shop is down the street, and you're saying, you know what? I heard that the doctor, but I'm looking for a sign. I'm looking for a sign of whether I should stop tomorrow and get the donuts. And so you tell yourself, if I find an open parking space in front of the donut shop, that must mean that I should stop. Well, what happens? You go to the donut shop and you find an empty parking space after driving around the block 20 times. In other words, you went around the block 19 times. You should have realized that that was the sign to not stop, but you kept looking for any information that would confirm your belief. And we have a tendency to do that. It's kind of like students saying, oh, I want to find information on the internet of why dogs are better than cats. So you type in why dogs are better than cats. And what are you going to find? All kinds of articles. Yeah, yes. You're going to do that. And we do that. We do that in area of politics. We do that in areas of government. We do that in areas of religion, everything. We look for information that's simply going to confirm our beliefs. Now, there is no time to talk about all of the logical fallacies, but the books that I showed, and again, remind me, Jaime, near the end.
I will.
To put that in, because I think this is can be very useful information, is there are all kinds of fallacies, stereotypes, groupthink, non sequitur means A does not equal B, and the list goes on and on and on. And the more we as teachers understand these things, like gaslighting, has anyone said to you, you don't understand, you don't see things clearly? That's called gaslighting. Okay. You're confused. So all of these fallacies and heuristics, as teachers become aware of them, then you're able to spotlight them. And in one of my classes called Debate, I teach these ideas to students because they're so important. So in the end, the eye sees only what the mind is prepared to comprehend. If you only see what you're looking for, and we want to help students avoid that. Now, just so you know, I'm not just speaking to our students. I'm speaking to each one of us. We want to be careful of that. And Now, these are some of the books that are on my bookshelf behind me. Now, you might say, Randall, you must think really critically. The problem is I am just as deluded as everyone else. I fall victim to these things. And so knowing these ideas and being aware of the resources is important. So we've talked about empowering students. We've talked about being aware of how unaware we are. We've talked about logical fallacies, thinking errors. And again, we could cover a whole presentation on each one of those. But I want to talk now about learning how to carefully scrutinize online information and then developing skills to analyze the information as well. Bonnie says correlation is not causation. Absolutely. That is so important there. Talking with strangers, another book. Thank you for sharing that, Brian. Well, let's go on to the next idea about scrutinizing information. Now, some of us might be doing this, but I'd like to kind of explore this just a little. The first idea is when you're looking at any source, who is the author and what are his or her credentials and affiliation? In other words, when you're going online and you're finding information about the author, Dr. So-and-so, not all doctors are specialized in the same areas. For example, if I have an issue with my eye, I'm not going to go to a podiatrist or something like that. I'm going to actually choose someone that specializes. And I tell my students, although, Jaime, you said I've taught for 35 years, I will say to students, if students say, Randall, can you give me some advice on reading? And I would say, reading is not my area of specialty. I do teach reading classes, but I would recommend to a couple of other teachers who have more experience in that area. So not all teachers are the same and so forth. The other idea with this is you want to look at any type of source is what is the author's goal and agenda? Is there any obvious bias? Who funded the research study? So sometimes students can't readily see that. More and more academic journals actually will indicate the study was funded by so-and-so, but sometimes each one of us have an agenda. I have an agenda today to share with you ideas regarding critical thinking. But you want to be careful as you're looking at articles. Everyone has an agenda. Everyone has a bias. Does that affect the outcomes of the study? That's important. It's kind of like if you were to look at a study and the study, let's say you're looking at a particular product and the product review was from the company that created the product and the company points back to itself as the reliable, credible source for information. You just want to be careful. The next idea would be, are the claims of the authors measurable? We often use, for example, quantitative data analysis versus qualitative or anecdotal evidence. And then, has the information been adjudicated or judged or even evaluated by independent sources? And we realize that not all journals are peer-reviewed. So again, all of these ideas are important, maybe more or less for the level of students that you're teaching, but I think these are important for us as teachers. The other ideas is talking about fact-checking resources, and feel free in the chat to share any fact-checking services that you use. I'm listing some up here like Google Scholar and PolitiFact and so forth, and each of these has their drawbacks and benefits. But one of the things, no matter what you use, you should always keep in mind this fact. And the fact is, the greatest enemy against rational thinking is arrogance and pride. Anytime you think that you understand the information because you've carefully analyzed it, you're probably falling victim to your own illogical reasoning. We all do that. So I often tell teachers, I often tell students, practice click restraint. In other words, as you're looking at information, before you start clicking on link after link after link, you want to actually go to different types of sources, which could be a whole different presentation to actually help you in that situation. So we've talked about, again, scrutinizing any online resource. We talked about, again, the nature of logical fallacies, developing skills to analyze and fact check. Again, I teach an 8-week course on debate, and we cover all of these things in 8 weeks, in addition to so many other things. But the next thing is, what if you end up arriving at a different conclusion? What do you do with that information? Now, for example, if I arrive at a different conclusion about my favorite restaurant, it's not going to put too much stress in my marriage. But if you come up with different opinions and views on politics or other things, it could create and alienate and cause friction among those that your families and your community and so forth. And so what I mean about having the courage to alter your opinions is this. Sometimes if a student has analyzed information, has come to a different conclusion about others, sometimes we are afraid and lack the courage to alter our convictions and to follow them. We should be willing to follow our new convictions based on carefully reasoned arguments. Sometimes we're aware that people might view this as small, as powerless, as defective, and so forth. But one of the things I think we need to keep in mind is that sometimes, and this is really important. Bonnie says, are there any activities or techniques to practice this change? Thanks for bringing that up. And hopefully I can cover that, my panel as well, about activities to help practice this change. Because one of the things I often talk in my classes about the power of groupthink. And Bonnie, if you contact me later, there is a lesson on groupthink that I help and that I share with my students to help them overcome groupthink. In other words, often people come up with conclusions and so forth, but instead of following their convictions, they have a tendency to go along with the group, even though they think differently. Because I think as human beings, we're fear of losing human connection, respect, dignity, even though we feel that we see things the way they really are. And one of the things I often encourage people is to do this. You can always stay silent in your new beliefs and understanding, but a comfort zone is the most dangerous area anyone can stay. It is a place of no growth and no challenges. Now, one of the things that I think drives us to remain silent, even though we've analyzed the information, we think we see things from a clear picture, maybe other people view things differently. There is a difference between fitting in and belonging. Anytime all of us often want to belong, and belonging means that you're able to show up as your true self. You're able to say how you feel without wearing of what I call a mask of inauthenticity. Fitting in means you mentally contort yourself. You wear a mask so that people really can't view you the way you really are. And sometimes we fight to just belong, but we end up just fitting in. And one of my favorite researchers wrote something dealing with vulnerability. And vulnerability is about showing up, sharing your ideas and being seen. But so often people are unable to do that. And that's a whole nother talk on the idea of vulnerability. But my idea here is that as you understand the world, as you analyze information, everyone wants to belong, and we need to create space for people being able to show up with their new opinions and sharing their ideas. The last thing I want to share before I join with my panel is the idea of showing learners the importance of soft skills in engaging with others. And what I mean by that is this. Number one, we need to be patient and listen to understand, not to reply. I mean, how many times have we been in conversations where, you know what, I'm listening to their idea, I don't agree with them, and in 2 minutes, I'm going to tell them how I think. That's not listening to understand. That's listening to reply. The next idea is validate the concerns and opinions of others, even though you might differ. People want to be heard and people want to be seen. I think those are really important things. And be the change that you want to see in others. If you tell students and you share all of these ideas about critical thinking, how it's important in shaping the world, in being better, and then acting better. You need to actually model that with your other students. Now, one of the things that I think, and kind of wrapping things up in this part, is that a mind that is stretched by a new experience can never go back to its old dimensions. In other words, as you help students and yourselves see the world in new ways, using these skills and understanding logical fallacies and mental shortcuts, you really can't put toothpaste back into the tube. You will experience constant growth in everything we do. And one of the things that teachers might say, you know what? Yeah, I've been teaching for 35 years, but I find that all of us, as we look at these different points right here, we can become what I consider very chameleonic. In other words, teachers have the abilities, students have the abilities to reshape their ideas, reshape their thinking, to accommodate new ideas, and then we begin to see the world in a more expansive way. So what I'd like to do right now is I'd like to bring on my panel, the panel for this plenary. So let's go ahead and begin. And I thank again, Brian and Pragya and Maysa'a for joining. Again, Pragya is from Nepal, working in Vancouver, Canada. Maysa'a is from Syria, working in the United Arab Emirates. And Brian is in the United States, but has taught and studied overseas. So let's go ahead, and any of you that are watching, if you could share any comments in the text chat, we'll try to make reference to those as well. But let's just start with the idea of, in the presentation, I was talking about examples of poor critical thinking, errors in everyday life. Brian, and then Pragya, can you speak to that idea?
I think from my perspective, just having taught most of my career outside of the US, it's been a challenge for my students, obviously, to think critically about sources and information, but me as well. And I think that touches on the Dunning-Kruger effect and what Randall was talking about, never assuming that we know or experts on a particular topic. For example, I was teaching for the last 10 years in Colombia at the University of Los Andes. And in the beginning, it took me a while to get up to speed on the validity of various sources. For example, knowing what newspapers have bias and on what side of the issue they traditionally fall on. And so it's one of the things that is very important to really make an effort to find out what the truth is, and then try to explain to our students, how they can see bias in sources. And one of the things that I like to use is fact-checking websites. And I just put a link to a Wikipedia page that has a collection of fact-checking websites by region and country. And so you guys can possibly use those in your own activities in the future.
Yeah, I think, Pragya, any thought on that of common critical thinking errors that you might see, not in your students, but in your neighbors, in yourself?
Yes, I agree to what Brian says. Technically, we were discussing about this COVID situation where the news popped on and it said like, okay, the virus was made in lab or anything, and everyone started believing. And when Randall, you were speaking about comfort zone, our students are so much comfortable that whatever they get the first-hand information, they think that's valid and they don't want to go beyond that. And social media makes a high influence on that too.
Absolutely. Maysa'a, any thought on common thinking errors that you might see within your own students or your own community?
Yes, I think for the critical thinking questions, I might avoid in my classes the stereotype, and I might also teach my students how to deal with the stereotypes. I mean, ready-made ideas. I'm going to teach my students that not all the things that we hear or read or we hear from neighbors, from friends are correct. We need to change our beliefs. We need to make sure of these ideas about people, especially about people. You know that sometimes we might read that in Western countries, it's not safe to walk alone at night because they heard it from a lot of people living there or from their friends, but they haven't checked whether it's true or false. So we have to make sure of these pieces of information before accepting them or making them apply to our life.
The other thing is, for those that are from Peru, Do you ever think, all the people in the Andes, the people in Lima, the people in Arequipa, sometimes we come up with broad generalizations that really probably are not true. And we want to be very careful about that type of framing. Next idea would be, and again, feel free to anything, share any ideas. The next idea is, in what ways are the points that I mentioned in the plenary related to your own teaching context or society in general? It's kind of similar to the poor critical thinking errors that I said, but any thoughts on that? Pragya?
To start off with, like, as a parent or as a teacher, we are very helpful people. We just think that our kids, they need help 24/7. We try to give some stuff and we'll be like, we just jump in and we say, do you need help? And we just develop a conclusion for them. We don't wait until they give something back to us, and we don't have that much patience to hear. So that's something I really work in my classroom. When I set out something, I'm like, okay, you can have your voice with your self-experience. Can you share that with me? And then I can give my input. I don't want to put my ideas on them and they just build that perception.
Right. Brian, any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I agree with Pragya. I think that, you know, as teachers also, we need to really be open to learning from our students, and having them sometimes instruct us on validity of information can be helpful, because that can help their own critical thinking process. It kind of reminds me of an activity that I do in class with bringing in a purposefully bad source. It's kind of, I call it bad source show and tell. And the students bring in an obviously biased source and then give a short presentation as to why. And I've learned a lot from those kind of presentations that has really formed my future lessons.
Oh, great. And I think when we're talking about biases and confirmation bias and so forth, as I've worked with my own students, sometimes I have a student that says, I now understand how things are really are in the United States. And I say, what do you mean? Well, before I came to Utah, I wasn't sure. I had heard that all North Americans enjoy fast food. And I went to I went to McDonald's yesterday and it was full of university students. And all of a sudden I'm trying to think, did you check out the 10 other restaurants around to see if any other university students were there? In other words, it's the idea of confirmation bias, of seeking out information that you think will confirm without checking other sources. And I think that's important. Maysa'a, any thought on that or other instructional ideas and tips that teachers who are watching could use?
Okay. Now, before that, I want to comment about something in your presentation. I felt, Randall, that there is a hidden message in your presentation. You wanted educators to change the way that they look at things from a different place. Because when you are changing the place, you are observing things, I think you might have a clearer vision. So when you are observing things from a different perspective, you will get to know new things that might be invisible to you. So when you change your position, you will see in a better way, and you can also observe the world in a better way, so that you can communicate with the whole world in a better way.
Right, my message is really...
I felt that this is the message. I felt that this is the hidden message.
Well, it is kind of a hidden message in the sense that, yes, my message is really to teachers today of not overestimating how little we know and how little we are aware of some of these issues, so that by doing so, we can help share those with students. What are some ideas, teaching ideas, whether you're in a high-tech resource environment or you're teaching, along the beach under a palm tree? What ideas can we implement and share with those that are watching today?
Okay. Now, I think that the most important thing that all educators or teachers should teach to their students is how to listen politely. Because once you are when you learn how to listen carefully and how to listen politely, you will be able to respond in a good way. And your responses in this way might also change a lot of things. They might change your beliefs. They might change the beliefs of the person you are arguing with, for instance. So listen carefully so that you can respond in a good way.
Yeah, and
This is one
Bonnie
of the
mentioned,
most important things that I'm going to teach to my students, especially when it
absolutely.
comes to conversation and debating.
Absolutely. And Bonnie mentions about active listening. We could go into a whole topic on that area. And one of the things I think is important, what you mentioned, Maysa'a, again, as I mentioned in the broadcast, listen to understand, not to reply. And it goes much beyond tolerance. Often we use that word too much. I need to tolerate other people. It's kind of like saying to my wife, Shirley, we've been married for many, many years, and I've come to tolerate you. That doesn't sound very impressive. So you're right, Maysa'a. You're right on about the critical role of listening. Pragya and then Brian.
For me, it would be more of making connection to your self-experience. Whatever age your kids are or you are, just try making connection with the experience. That really helps in developing critical thinking, like really good in classroom or anywhere in real life situations.
Now, I'm going to come back to you in a minute. And if you can think of something specific in a minute, Brian, if you could speak to some ideas, and then if you can think of an example of that, we'd be happy to hear that, Pragya.
Yeah, so for all of you that don't know me well, I come from much more of an academic writing perspective. And so a lot of things that I deal with in class are sourcing informative papers or argumentative papers. And one of the things that I do as an activity is called source ranking. And sometimes I bring in the 4 sources, sometimes I have a student bring them in. But what we do is, as a class, read critically all 4 sources and then make a determination in terms of informational quality. What is the ranking of the sources? Then we also do a short report on any perceived bias that we see. So what is the underlying position of the author and the news organization itself, as it were? For example, if you have international students in the United States, sometimes it's difficult for them to tell the difference between a source like a blog, for example. And so trying to get people to understand the media environment in which they're writing in is really important. Colombia, for example, having an article from Publimetro, El Espectador, and Semana magazine, you have to find as a teacher what are the quality of those sources. And so that's where I kind of take my students' cue to learn when I'm teaching in a different country, because it's also our job to learn those things as well.
All right. Thank you, Brian. And I just put out a text message into the chat for any questions that people might have about for the panel today. Pragya, going back to your thought, could you share maybe a little bit more?
About making connection, I can share a very, it's like a really fun experience in my classroom. So I was talking about stereotypes in classroom, and we were like, generally, when you look up, do you look up to your dad? You want to be like your dad or like your mom? And everyone is like my dad. I'm like, why not mom? So that's one conversation we were having. And then I said, okay, do you know about this stereotype when we think that preschool teachers can only be female teachers, not male teachers? The elementary teachers are always female teachers, and the high school and university teachers are male. And my student, she just raised her hand and said, but teacher, when I was in grade 2, I had a male teacher. So that's one connection. She just shared her experience, and everyone was like, okay, so we need to think beyond whatever the stereotype is. Right. Anything can change. So that's how we try to connect with our real life experience and talk about it.
Now, when I ask my students, if you have a problem, who do you go to, mom or dad? And they often say, well, it depends. Okay, so you crashed the car. Mom. You need money. Mom. It always seems like mom and not dad. But I think I like the idea of critical thinking of, and I know Maysa'a, before the broadcast, you and I were talking about hypotheticals, coming up with hypothetical situations that could be useful. Could you think, Maysa'a, about a simple example of a hypothetical that could be used for critical thinking at different levels?
Yes, exactly. So one of the trainings that I got while we were preparing for an inspection at school, especially, you know that the idea of critical thinking is very important in every class in the United Arab Emirates. So there must be a critical thinking question in every lesson. And the inspection will observe all of these things. So one of the techniques that they taught us was to create a critical thinking question that starts either with imagine or what if. Now, if you use these 2 words, two expressions, what if or imagine, I think the level of the thinking of the students might be raised up. Like, for instance, one of the questions that I like to ask my students, imagine that you were sent into, or imagine that you were sent into the outer space in a space mission. Would you introduce the Earth to the aliens, or would you hide the Earth from the aliens? Now, notice that we have different responses from students. Some of them said, yes, of course, I'm going to speak about my planet. I'm going to let them know that our planet is very beautiful and it's known as the blue planet. So we will introduce it. Other students respond in a completely different way. They said that, of course, we are not going to let them know about our planet because they might be invaders and they might make colonies on our planet. So the use of these two expressions might raise the level, and we might have different ideas. We might have also some time to debate about these things. So I think it's lovely to have critical thinking questions in the classroom.
Now, let me bring up, and I saw, Brian, your comment there, who's going to protect the aliens from us? I think that's a really good comment. It really helps us explore. Now, let me share with you something that often is avoided in the classroom, but yet where we still want to have students skilled to think critically. Often issues regarding politics, often issues regarding religion, often may or may not enter into our classrooms, but we really can't ignore the need for students to understand that type of information as well. Brian, any thought on that, of how to kind of encourage critical thinking while those topics may or may not be part of our own classrooms?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, coming from an international perspective, I spent the last 10 years working in Colombia. And in my classes, we did a lot of writing about the peace process. And, that's an issue, if you know South America well, it's an issue that's been going on in Colombian politics for quite some time, and it's very divisive. And so a lot of these exercises that I've done with critical thinking skills have been related to this topic. And it's, once again, something that as educators, we just have to have the humility to sometimes listen and learn from our students. And so for me, it's always been a very collaborative process in this road towards critical thinking skills. And so that's just one example that I can think of, when we're teaching in environments that are new to us, always trying to keep an open mind.
All right, thank you. There is a question that came into the chat by Nancy. Thank you, Nancy, for sharing. I teach in a girls' school to 11 to 17-year-old students. How can I use hypothetical situations? Which aspects would be more suitable for them? Anyone thoughts on that? Again, 11 to 17-year-olds, hypothetical, maybe what type of hypothetical? How do I encourage critical thinking in that case? Anything?
I think, Randall, I think I can help here. So the first step to do that is to understand the background of the class, of the students themselves, so that she can create and can prepare the hypothetical questions that suit the culture of her students.
Yeah, and that's really important, suited to the culture. And one thing that I often don't realize is I don't often understand the backgrounds, and I make simplistic assumptions about what they do and don't know. Pragya, any other thought on hypotheticals, something that could be useful?
The one that I want to add, what Brian and Maysa'a said about religion and politics, somewhere we are very reluctant to get students' voice on those topics. So what happens, we think like they have a prefixed mindset that, okay, Muslims are this, or Hindus are this, or Sikh are this. So slowly, if we try listening to their voices, I think that really helps. Because when they're too young, like grade 5 or grade 6, we think their view does not matter. And we just try to, like, whatever your parents' belief are, you have to have the same belief. So we try to put that thought on them. I think that we really need to work on. Students' voice really matters on those things.
Good. And Nancy says, thank you, Maysa'a, for sharing your idea. Much appreciated. Brian, any last thought on hypotheticals? And then we'll close with any maybe final remarks.
I don't think I could add anything more to what Pragya said. I think it was very prescient. And yeah, I just really appreciate all the great comments on this.
Pragya and Maysa'a and Brian, any final thoughts that you might have on just critical thinking, on the world around us, and why this would be important? Your own experiences and learning to think critically, maybe thinking errors that you've had in the past. Any last thoughts? Oh, Maysa'a.
Oh, okay. Randall, I think that sometimes the laws in a country might help you to open any discussion, whether it's related to politics or religion. For instance, in the UAE, you cannot insult any religion. That's why people, you know, that we are a multicultural and multiracial community. You know that we have different nationalities, we have a lot of religions. So that's why we are living peacefully here. The laws of the countries might help the community to be open-minded, really.
Pragya and then Brian, any last thought?
For me, like to embed a critical thinking in class, I would agree to one statement that like it really hit me when Brian said that we need to be a lifelong learner and listen to our kids. It's not that we are superior and we know everything. So we learn with everything. So I think that's the best way to embed critical thinking in classroom.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing. Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, moving on from what she said, being a lifelong learner is very important. And I think for us, always trying to keep abreast of new sources of information and new ways to learn is really important because, you know, as teachers, we can tend to have our skills fossilized in terms of doing research on a particular topic. And sometimes not discounting new forms of media. I'm not telling you to run out and do investigations on TikTok, but I'm saying that there's a wealth of information all over the planet and it's our job to seek it out. So that's what I'd leave us with.
Great. Well, we, Pragya, Brian, Maysa'a, and I want to thank all of you for joining. And again, I think what we're all trying to share is the idea that we often don't see the world the way it fully is. And as I mentioned at the beginning, true wisdom is knowing that we know nothing, and each step forward helps us see things better so that we can be better and actually act better toward our global neighbors.
Okay, thank you, dear Randall Davis, Brian, Pragya, and Maysa'a. Thank you so much for such important information and reflection on critical thinking. We will have time to watch these videos again, so we will have time to reflect and make our own ideas about this very important topic.